Andrew had never known a world without Cooper. From the moment he took his first steps, the old dog had been there, first as a sprightly pup, then as a loyal companion through every stage of his young life. At 13, Andrew had friends at school, video games to play, and places to be, but no one in his world understood him quite like Cooper did. There was something about the silent companionship of a dog that words could never replace. Cooper had once been the fastest dog in the neighborhood, chasing after frisbees with the boundless energy of a creature that seemed to believe it would live forever. But forever wasn't real, and time had slowed him down. His once golden coat had turned gray around the muzzle. His steps had become slower, and he no longer jumped at the sound of a bouncing ball. Yet, one thing never changed: his devotion to Andrew. Every morning, without fail, Cooper would walk with Andrew to the school bus stop. He couldn't go beyond the school gates, but he always waited. Even when his legs ached, even when his breathing was heavier, he would sit by the fence, tail wagging weakly, eyes fixed on the spot where Andrew would return at the end of the day. Andrew never really thought much about it. It was just something Cooper did, like breathing, like existing. It was the way things had always been, and he never imagined a time when it wouldn't be. But time was catching up to them. That afternoon, the air was colder than usual. Winter was creeping in, its icy fingers threading through the town, chilling everything in its path. Andrew had stayed late at school for a group project. Something about an upcoming history presentation he couldn't even bring himself to care about. When he finally slung his backpack over his shoulder and started the walk home, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of burnt orange and dusky purple. He walked through the familiar streets, his pace quickening as he neared the school entrance. And then he saw him. Cooper was still there. The old dog lay curled up near the school fence, his body slightly shivering from the cold. His ears twitched at the sound of Andrew's approaching footsteps, and slowly, with visible effort, he lifted his head. His eyes, though clouded with age, still held that familiar warmth, that unwavering love that had never wavered, not once. His tail thumped lightly against the pavement, weak but steady, as if saying, "I knew you'd come back." Andrew felt his heart clench. "Cooper," he breathed, dropping to his knees beside the dog. He ran his fingers through Cooper's fur, feeling how much thinner it had become. There was a time when his coat was thick and full, but now it felt frail, brittle against the cold. "You didn't have to wait, you know," Andrew murmured, rubbing Cooper's head gently. "You could have gone home. It's freezing out here." Cooper didn't move, only rested his chin against Andrew's arm, sighing contentedly. Andrew hated the way that sigh sounded. It was deep, tired, too heavy for a dog that had once been so full of life. For the first time, Andrew really looked at Cooper. Not just a glance, not just a passing acknowledgement, but really looked. He noticed the way his breathing was slower, how he took longer to get up, how his legs trembled slightly under his own weight. He had always known Cooper was old, but he had never really thought about what that meant. And now, staring into those patient, trusting eyes, Andrew felt a sudden, unbearable fear creep into his chest. How much longer did they have? The thought sent a sharp pang through him, and he shook his head as if trying to physically push it away. No, he wouldn't think like that. Cooper had always been there, and he always would be. That's just how things worked. Andrew adjusted his grip on his backpack, then slid it off completely, setting it aside. He wasn't in a rush to get home anymore. Instead, he sat there on the pavement, beside his best friend, his arm draped over Cooper's back, shielding him from the cold as best as he could. They stayed like that for a long while, watching as the last light of the sun faded, replaced by the quiet hum of street lamps flickering on. At some point, Andrew let out a breathless chuckle. "You're ridiculous, you know that?" he said, shaking his head. You don't have to wait for me every single day. You could have gone home where it's warm. You could have... His voice caught in his throat, and he swallowed hard. Cooper simply leaned against him, as if saying, "But I wanted to." Andrew exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening slightly in Cooper's fur. "You're an idiot," he whispered. But there was no real anger behind the words, just a quiet sadness, a realization settling in the pit of his stomach like a weight he wasn't ready to carry yet. He didn't know then that this moment, this quiet, seemingly ordinary moment, would be one of the last times they would sit together like this. That soon the waiting would end. That soon he would come home, and Cooper wouldn't be there. But for now, for this fleeting instant, everything was just as it had always been, and Andrew let himself believe, just for a little longer, that it always would be. Andrew had noticed the small changes in Cooper before, but he had brushed them aside, convincing himself they weren't anything serious. The way Cooper hesitated before standing, the slower pace of his steps, the way his breathing had become heavier after a short walk. These were things that Andrew had chalked up to old age, natural and inevitable, but nothing to worry about. But today was different. Andrew stood at the front door, backpack slung over one shoulder, waiting for Cooper to follow him outside. Normally, the old dog would wag his tail and trot after him, determined to accompany Andrew to school, just as he always had. But this morning, Cooper didn't move. He lay curled up in his usual spot near the door, his eyes half-lidded, his breaths slow and labored. His ears perked up slightly at the sound of Andrew's voice, but he made no attempt to rise. Andrew frowned. "Come on, buddy," he said, his voice light, trying to coax Cooper to his feet. "We gotta go, or I'll be late." Still, Cooper remained where he was. He let out a small, tired sigh, his tail giving one weak thump against the wooden floor. It was the best he could do. Andrew felt something heavy settle in his chest. Kneeling beside his best friend, he reached out and ran his fingers through Cooper's fur. "You okay, boy?" he murmured. Cooper leaned into his touch, but the usual energy that once burned in his eyes was dimmer now, distant, as if he were drifting somewhere far away. Andrew swallowed hard. "I'll be home soon," he whispered, pressing his forehead lightly against Cooper's. "Just rest, okay?" But all throughout the day, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his stomach. When the final school bell rang, Andrew didn't wait around to talk to his friends or pack his things neatly. He bolted from the classroom, sprinting home as fast as his legs could carry him. His heart pounded in his chest, and a nagging fear clawed at the back of his mind. What if something had happened while he was gone? By the time he reached his house, his lungs were burning from the run, but none of that mattered. He flung the door open and rushed inside, his gaze immediately searching for Cooper. The old dog was still lying by the door, just as Andrew had left him. Relief flooded through him, but only for a second, because now, up close, he could see how much worse Cooper looked. His breathing was even slower, his body limp, his once muscular frame looking far too small against the floorboards. Andrew didn't hesitate. He grabbed his phone and called his mother, his voice shaky as he begged her to come home. An hour later, Andrew sat in the back seat of their car, his hands gripping Cooper's paw as his mom drove them to the vet. The entire time, Andrew kept whispering reassurances, even if he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince, Cooper or himself. "It's gonna be okay," he murmured, stroking the soft fur behind Cooper's ear. "You just need some medicine, and then you'll be fine." But even as he said it, his chest tightened. The vet's office smelled of antiseptic and something else. Something sterile. Something Andrew hated. He sat in the small exam room as the doctor ran tests, checking Cooper's heartbeat, his breathing, his limbs. Andrew held his breath the entire time, unable to shake the horrible sense of dread that had wrapped around him like a vice. And then the vet looked at him with soft, apologetic eyes. Andrew's stomach dropped. "I'm so sorry, Andrew," the vet said gently. "But Cooper, He doesn't have much time left. Andrew blinked. The words didn't make sense at first, like they were in another language entirely. His ears rang, and his vision blurred at the edges. What? His voice was barely a whisper. The vet sighed, setting down the clipboard. His body is shutting down. His organs are failing. At his age, there's nothing we can do to reverse it. Andrew's breath hitched. No. This wasn't happening. Cooper had been by his side for his entire life. He had been there when Andrew scraped his knee on the sidewalk at 6 years old, licking the wound as if that alone would make it better. He had been there when Andrew had his first fight with his best friend in 3rd grade, resting his head on Andrew's lap in silent comfort. He had been there through every sleepless night, every thunderstorm, every lonely moment. How could he be dying? Andrew shook his head, his hands trembling as he reached for Cooper, clutching onto him like he could somehow anchor him to this world. There has to be something we can do, he choked out. The vet gave him a sad smile. We can make sure he's comfortable. We can give him medicine to ease his pain. But Andrew... She hesitated before continuing, her voice soft but firm. He only has a few weeks left. Andrew felt his world tilt on its axis. A few weeks. That was all the time he had left with Cooper. Tears blurred his vision as he looked down at his best friend. Cooper stared back at him, his tail wagging weakly, as if trying to tell him that it was okay. But it wasn't. Andrew bit his lip hard enough to hurt, trying to keep himself from breaking down completely. He had never known a world without Cooper, and now he was being asked to say goodbye. The car ride home was silent. That night, Andrew curled up beside Cooper on the floor, his arms wrapped tightly around him. The tears he had held back all afternoon finally fell, hot and unrelenting, soaking into the fur of the dog who had given him a lifetime of unconditional love. I don't want you to go, Andrew whispered, his voice cracking. We still have so much to do. You were supposed to be there when I graduate, when I get my first job, when I... His throat closed up and he pressed his face into Cooper's fur, his shoulders shaking. But through the pain, through the unbearable ache of knowing their time was slipping away, a thought formed. If Cooper only had a few weeks left, then Andrew would make sure they were the best weeks of his life. He wiped at his eyes and took a shaky breath. We're going on an adventure, he murmured. One last trip, just me and you. Cooper let out a soft sigh, curling closer to him, and in that moment, Andrew made a silent promise. Cooper wouldn't leave this world alone. Andrew would make sure of it. Andrew woke up to the golden hues of the morning sun streaming through his bedroom window. His body ached from sleeping on the floor beside Cooper, but he didn't care. As soon as he opened his eyes, his hand instinctively reached out, brushing against the warm fur of his best friend. Cooper was still there, breathing steadily, his old body rising and falling with each slow breath. Andrew exhaled, relieved that they had another day together, but he knew their time was slipping through his fingers, each second more precious than the last. Today, they would begin their journey. He had promised Cooper an adventure, a trip down memory lane, visiting the places that had meant the most to them. And first on that list was the meadow. The meadow had been their place, long before Andrew had even started school. It was the first spot his parents had taken him and Cooper when they were both small. Andrew, just a toddler, barely able to walk, and Cooper, a rambunctious little puppy, all legs and excitement. They had spent countless afternoons there, chasing butterflies, rolling in the grass, and lying on their backs, staring up at the sky. Now, it was time to go back. Andrew packed a small bag, some water, a few treats for Cooper, and an old frisbee that had been long forgotten in the back of his closet. He knew Cooper couldn't chase it anymore, but bringing it felt right, like holding on to a piece of the past. With a gentle nudge, he helped Cooper stand up. The old dog stretched slowly, his legs stiff, but his tail gave a small wag as if he knew something special was about to happen. "Come on, buddy," Andrew murmured, his voice soft, yet steady. "One last run." The walk to the meadow wasn't long, but for Cooper, it felt like a marathon. His steps were slow, his breathing heavier than usual, but he pressed on, just like he always did. Andrew stayed right beside him, matching his pace, his heart aching with every strained movement Cooper made. When they finally reached the meadow, Andrew paused, letting the familiar sight wash over him. The grass stretched out before them, swaying in the gentle breeze. Wildflowers dotted the landscape, their colors vibrant against the endless green. The air was thick with the scent of earth and summer, warm and comforting. For a moment, Andrew could almost hear the echoes of their past. His younger self's laughter, Cooper's excited barks, the rustling of leaves as they ran through the fields together. Andrew knelt beside his old friend, running a hand through his fur. "Remember this place, Coop?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Cooper let out a soft huff, his eyes scanning the meadow, his ears twitching as if listening for something familiar. Andrew smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "Come on, let's go see if you can still catch leaves." He reached down, picking up a crisp autumn leaf from the ground. When they were younger, he used to toss them into the air just to watch Cooper leap up and snap them in his jaws, tail wagging furiously as if he had just won the greatest prize in the world. Andrew held the leaf between his fingers, then threw it high into the sky. It twirled gracefully in the wind, dancing downward in slow spirals. But Cooper didn't chase it. He didn't even try. He only stood there, watching it fall to the ground, his head tilting slightly as if remembering how he used to play that game. His legs trembled slightly as though he wanted to move, wanted to run, but his body wouldn't let him. Andrew felt something shatter inside him. He had known Cooper was slowing down. He had seen it, felt it, but this was different. This was undeniable proof that time had finally caught up to them. Kneeling down, Andrew reached out and gently cupped Cooper's face in his hands. The dog's eyes, still filled with love, looked up at him, waiting. "You don't have to chase it," Andrew whispered, stroking the soft fur around Cooper's ears. "Just being here with me is enough." Cooper exhaled a deep, content sigh and leaned into Andrew's touch. For a long time, they just sat there, letting the wind carry their memories around them. Andrew wanted to stay in that moment forever, to freeze time and never move forward. But he knew he couldn't. The sun was beginning to sink lower in the sky, and Cooper was getting tired. Reluctantly, he stood up, brushing the grass from his jeans. "Come on, let's get you home," he murmured. But as he turned, he noticed Cooper hesitating. The dog stood still for a moment, gazing out at the meadow as if he were memorizing it, imprinting every detail into his mind. Andrew swallowed hard. This was goodbye. Not in the way he had feared, not yet, but Cooper knew, just as Andrew did, that this was their last time here together. Slowly, Andrew moved beside him, slipping his arm under Cooper's belly to help him walk. The once strong dog, who had always been the one protecting Andrew, now leaned against him for support. Step by step, they left the meadow behind. With every careful stride, Andrew realized something. This was the first time he was the one looking after Cooper instead of the other way around. And no matter how much it hurt, he wouldn't trade this moment for anything. The journey to the lake was slower than Andrew had expected. Cooper's steps were heavy, his legs trembling more than before, and his breathing was labored. Each movement seemed to take more effort than it should have, but the old dog pressed on, his determination unwavering. Andrew walked beside him, matching his pace, occasionally reaching down to steady him when Cooper's legs wobbled too much. The thought that Cooper, once so full of energy, always bounding ahead, now needed help just to keep moving made something tighten in Andrew's chest. The lake wasn't far. It was a place Andrew had practically grown up in, spending endless summers splashing in the cool water, with Cooper always at his side. The mere thought of it brought back a flood of memories, each one more bittersweet than the last. As they reached the edge of the woods, the trees parted, revealing the lake in all its familiar beauty. The water shimmered beneath the midday sun, reflecting the sky like a mirror. The gentle lapping of the waves against the shore was a sound Andrew had always associated with laughter, adventure, and a sense of pure freedom. But today, it felt different. Today, it felt like a farewell. Andrew turned to Cooper, who had stopped just a few steps away from the shoreline. The dog's head was raised slightly, his tired eyes scanning the water as if he too was remembering all the summers they had spent here. A ghost of a smile tugged at Andrew's lips as he crouched beside his best friend, resting a hand on his back. "You remember this place, don't you, buddy?" Cooper let out a soft huff, his ears twitching at the sound of the water. Andrew swallowed hard. He didn't want this to feel like goodbye, but he knew, deep down, that's exactly what it was. He looked out at the water, and as he did, an old memory surfaced. It had been years ago. He must have been around 7 or 8 at the time. The day had been scorching hot, the kind of summer day where the air felt thick and heavy, and all he could think about was cooling off in the lake. Andrew had never been a strong swimmer, but that hadn't stopped him from wading out too far, his excitement overriding any sense of caution. He had laughed, kicking his legs, feeling the rush of the cool water against his sun-warmed skin. But then, in an instant, everything had changed. One wrong step, and suddenly he couldn't feel the ground beneath his feet. Panic had surged through him as he flailed, the water pulling him under. He had tried to scream, but only swallowed more water, his chest tightening in fear. And then, before the darkness could fully take him, something strong had grabbed hold of him. Cooper. The dog had leapt into the water without hesitation, his teeth gently latching onto the back of Andrew's shirt. With powerful strokes, he had pulled him back toward the shore, never once letting go. Andrew could still remember the feeling of the sand beneath his hands as he coughed and sputtered, the warmth of the sun on his wet skin as he gasped for breath. And through his blurry vision, he had seen Cooper sitting beside him, panting, his tail wagging slightly as if to say, "I've got you." That day, Cooper had saved his life. Andrew had never forgotten it. And now, as he sat beside his aging friend at the edge of the same lake, he realized something painful. Cooper had always been the one protecting him. Through scraped knees, lonely nights, and childhood fears, Cooper had always been there, silently guarding him. But now it was Andrew's turn. He reached out, gently rubbing behind Cooper's ears. "You saved me once, remember?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the gentle sound of the waves. Cooper leaned into his touch, his body warm against Andrew's side. Andrew smiled, though there was a tightness in his throat. "Well, now it's my turn." Slowly he shifted, wrapping an arm under Cooper's belly to help him up. The dog struggled slightly, but Andrew held firm, guiding him forward toward the water. When they were younger, Cooper would have already been halfway across the lake by now, splashing excitedly, barking at the fish, challenging Andrew to races he could never win. But today, as Andrew carefully led him to the shoreline, Cooper simply stopped. The water brushed against his paws, cool and inviting, but he didn't take another step. Instead, he just stood there, staring out at the lake, his ears flicking as the breeze ruffled his fur. Andrew watched him, his chest aching. For the first time, Cooper wasn't running toward the water. He wasn't jumping in, wasn't barking excitedly for Andrew to follow. He was just looking, like he knew, like he understood this was the last time he'd see this place. Andrew's throat tightened, but he forced himself to smile. "It's okay," he murmured, stroking Cooper's back. "You don't have to go in." Cooper sighed, a deep, content sound, and leaned against Andrew's leg. They stayed like that for a long time, just watching the lake together. The past and present seemed to blur, memories of laughter and splashing water mingling with the quiet stillness of this moment. And Andrew realized this was enough. Cooper didn't need to run through the water one last time. He didn't need to relive the past. Just being here together was enough. Andrew bent down, pressing his forehead against Cooper's. "You saved me once," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Cooper's tail gave a weak wag. Andrew took a shaky breath, tightening his grip on his best friend. "And now I'm staying with you." The air had shifted. Andrew could feel it the moment they turned away from the lake, beginning the slow, careful walk back home. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the trees. The world felt quieter than usual, the soft rustling of leaves blending with the rhythmic sound of Cooper's slow footsteps beside him. The old dog was moving even more sluggishly now, his body weighed down by exhaustion. Andrew kept a hand on Cooper's back, offering him steady support as they walked through the clearing. Every few steps, he would pause to let Cooper catch his breath, whispering reassurances even though his own heart felt unbearably heavy. They had spent the day reliving old memories. One last time at the meadow, one last time by the lake. Andrew wished he could freeze these moments, hold on to them forever. But as he watched Cooper struggle to put one paw in front of the other, he knew time was slipping away faster than he wanted to admit. Then, the silence shattered. A sharp rustling in the underbrush made Andrew freeze. His body tensed, his ears straining. It was different from the usual noises of the forest, the chirping of birds, the skittering of small creatures. This was heavier, closer. Cooper stopped too. His ears, though not as sharp as they used to be, twitched. His head lifted slightly, his nostrils flaring. Andrew turned slowly, scanning the tree line. His heart pounded as his gaze landed on something that made the blood in his veins turn to ice. A pair of glowing yellow eyes stared back at him. A wolf. It was lean, its fur a mottled gray, blending perfectly with the shadows of the trees. Its stance was low, its muscles taut beneath its thick coat. It wasn't moving yet, just watching, as if calculating its next move. Andrew swallowed hard, his mind racing. They were alone out here. No one would hear him if he screamed. His first instinct was to run. His body screamed at him to bolt, to get as far away as possible, but he knew better. Running would only make them prey. He sucked in a sharp breath and took a cautious step back, keeping his eyes locked on the predator in front of him. But then, before he could react, Cooper moved. The old dog, weak and trembling just moments ago, stepped in front of Andrew. Andrew's breath caught. "Cooper, no," he whispered. But Cooper didn't listen. Despite his failing body, despite the weight of age pressing down on him, Cooper stood his ground. His fur bristled, his head lowered in warning. A low, rumbling growl built in his chest, a sound that, though weaker than it had once been, still carried the same unwavering determination. The wolf took a step closer, its ears flattening, its gaze flicking between them. It was testing, gauging their reaction. Andrew's heart pounded so hard it hurt. He could feel the panic clawing at his throat, but he forced himself to stay still. Cooper didn't move. His tail was stiff, his stance firm despite the unsteady wobble in his legs. He was doing what he had always done. He was protecting Andrew, even now, even with barely any strength left. Tears burned at the edges of Andrew's eyes. He couldn't let Cooper do this alone. Gritting his teeth, Andrew reached down and grabbed a rock, his fingers wrapped tightly around the smooth surface, his knuckles turning white. He could feel his entire body trembling, but he refused to back down. The wolf took another step forward. Andrew moved before he could second-guess himself. With all the strength he could muster, he pulled his arm back and threw the rock as hard as he could. It hit its mark. The stone struck the wolf's shoulder with a sharp crack, sending it stumbling back with a surprised snarl. For a moment, everything was still. Then, with a final flick of its tail, the wolf turned and vanished into the trees. Silence. Andrew stood there, his chest heaving, his hands shaking, his entire body felt frozen, like he had just stepped out of a nightmare. Then he felt it. A familiar weight leaning against him. He looked down and his heart shattered. Cooper was slumped against his leg, his sides rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. The effort had drained him completely. Andrew dropped to his knees beside him, his hands immediately reaching out, running over Cooper's fur, checking, praying that nothing was wrong. "You're okay," Andrew whispered, his voice breaking. "You're okay, buddy." But Cooper was exhausted. The last of his strength had been used protecting Andrew. Andrew let out a choked sob, wrapping his arms around his best friend, holding on to him like he could somehow keep him here. "You didn't have to do that," he whispered, pressing his face into Cooper's fur. "You didn't have to." But he knew. Of course Cooper had done it. Because that's who he was. A protector. A guardian. Andrew felt it now. How fragile Cooper was beneath his hands, how thin he had become, how tired. The weight of reality crashed down on him. This was it. This was the moment he had been trying so desperately to ignore. Cooper had been holding on for him, fighting for him. But he couldn't fight forever. Tears slipped down Andrew's cheeks as he cradled Cooper in his arms. "You don't have to protect me anymore," he whispered. Cooper let out a soft, tired sigh, and Andrew realized this was the last time Cooper would ever need to. From now on, it was Andrew's turn to protect him. The sun was beginning to set as Andrew trudged up the familiar path, his arm wrapped securely around Cooper's frail body. The old dog leaned against him heavily, his once powerful legs trembling with every step. Each breath Cooper took was slow and labored, his chest rising and falling with an exhaustion that made Andrew's heart ache. They were almost there. The hill had always been their place. It was where Andrew had gone when he needed to think, where he had watched the seasons change, where he had laughed and played with Cooper for as long as he could remember. It was where the world had always felt still and peaceful, where everything had made sense, even when nothing else did. And now, it would be the place where he said goodbye. Andrew swallowed hard, blinking against the sting of tears as he tightened his grip around Cooper, helping him take one slow, deliberate step at a time. "You're doing great, buddy," he murmured softly, though his voice shook. "Just a little more. We're almost there." Cooper let out a quiet huff, his tail giving the faintest wag as if to acknowledge Andrew's words. He was trying. Andrew knew he was, but his body was giving out. Andrew's throat tightened. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the top of the hill. The view stretched out before them, golden and endless, the sun casting warm hues across the sky. It looked just as it always had, breathtaking and peaceful, the kind of beauty that made the world feel timeless. Andrew lowered himself onto the grass, pulling Cooper gently into his lap. The dog let out a small sigh, his body curling against Andrew's warmth, as if he, too, remembered every moment they had spent here together. For a while, neither of them moved. They just sat there, watching as the sky melted into shades of orange and pink, the last light of the day reflecting in Cooper's tired eyes. Andrew ran a hand through Cooper's fur, his fingers memorizing the texture, the way it had changed over the years. It had once been thick and golden, full of life. Now it was thinner, grayer, softer. His best friend had grown old, and now it was time. Andrew felt the tears spill over before he could stop them. They slid down his cheeks, warm and silent, soaking into the fur beneath his fingertips. "I don't want you to go," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "I don't know how to be without you." Cooper let out a quiet exhale, his body pressing closer as if to say, I know. Andrew closed his eyes, his arms tightening around Cooper, holding him the way Cooper had held him all these years, through every scraped knee, every heartbreak, every lonely night. "You've done so much for me," Andrew whispered. "More than I ever deserved. You were always there, even when I didn't realize how much I needed you." Cooper didn't move, but Andrew felt it, the steady beat of his heart, slowing. His breath caught. "I don't want you to go," he repeated, voice breaking, and then softer, more painful. "But I want you to rest." A tear slipped onto Cooper's fur as Andrew pressed his forehead against his best friend's. "You don't have to hold on for me anymore." For a moment, everything was still. Then, with a final contented sigh, Cooper closed his eyes. His body relaxed, his breathing grew fainter, and as the last light of the sun dipped below the horizon, he was gone. Andrew held him tighter, his chest heaving with silent sobs, his heart breaking in ways he never knew it could. The world around him continued. The wind still blew, the trees still swayed, the stars still appeared one by one in the darkening sky. But Andrew's world had changed forever. He sat there for what felt like hours, his arms wrapped around Cooper, unwilling to let go, unwilling to move. Because moving meant accepting that Cooper was no longer here, and he wasn't ready for that. Not yet. A week had passed, 7 days since the last sunset they had watched together, 7 mornings where Andrew had woken up and reached for the familiar warmth beside him, only to find empty space. 7 nights of staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence that had once been filled with the gentle rise and fall of Cooper's breath. The house felt different now, quieter, emptier. Cooper's food bowl still sat in the corner of the kitchen, untouched. His bed remained near the fireplace, where he had always loved to curl up on cold nights. Andrew's mom had asked if he wanted to put them away, but he had only shaken his head. He wasn't ready to let go. But today, as the late afternoon sun stretched golden across the sky, Andrew knew he couldn't avoid it forever. He needed to say goodbye. So he made the familiar walk back to the hill, Cooper's worn leather collar clutched tightly in his hand. The path was the same as always, but it felt different without the rhythmic padding of paws beside him. Every rustling leaf, every whisper of wind made him think, just for a second, that Cooper was still there, trotting along at his side, tongue hanging out, eyes bright. But then reality would settle back in, heavy and unshakable. When he reached the top of the hill, he stopped, taking in the view. It looked just as it had a week ago, the same rolling landscape, the same endless sky. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, painting the clouds in soft hues of orange and pink. Andrew exhaled slowly. This had been their place, and now it would always be. He knelt beneath the large oak tree where they had spent so many evenings together, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. His fingers tightened around the small wooden plaque he had brought with him, the one he had spent hours carving the night before. Cooper, my best friend. His hands trembled slightly as he placed it at the base of the tree. He pressed it into the earth, making sure it wouldn't move, then leaned back on his heels, staring at the simple memorial. It wasn't enough. Nothing ever would be. But it was something. A way to keep Cooper here, in the place they had loved the most. Andrew swallowed the lump in his throat and pulled Cooper's collar into his lap, running his fingers over the worn leather. It smelled like him, like home, like comfort. He closed his eyes. The memories flooded in all at once, the way Cooper had bounded through the tall grass as a puppy, ears flopping with every step. The way he had always known when Andrew was sad, pressing his cold nose against his cheek as if to say, "I'm here." The way his tail had wagged, slow and steady, even in his final moments. Andrew had never believed in ghosts. But as the wind picked up, rustling the leaves around him, he could have sworn he heard the soft thud of paws against the earth. Like Cooper was still running through the meadow, like he had never left. A small smile tugged at the corners of Andrew's lips. He lifted the collar and carefully draped it over the wooden plaque, letting it rest there, a silent promise that this place would always belong to Cooper. Then he leaned back against the tree, stretching his legs out in the grass, and let out a slow breath. For the first time in a week, the weight pressing against his chest felt a little lighter. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the hill. Andrew tilted his head back, eyes closing as he let the warmth sink into his skin. And for a moment, just a moment, he could almost feel the familiar weight of a head resting against his knee, almost hear the steady breathing beside him, almost see the golden fur catching the last light of day. Andrew opened his eyes and smiled softly at the empty space beside him. "You'll always be here with me," he murmured. "Forever." And as the wind swept through the trees, carrying with it the echoes of laughter, of paw prints in the dirt, of memories that would never fade, Andrew knew the truth. Cooper might be gone, but he would never be alone. This heartwarming story is more than just another tale about loss. It's a testament to love, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between a boy and his dog. It reminds us why dog stories hold such a special place in our hearts. Dogs don't just exist alongside us. They shape our lives, teach us about unconditional love, and in their own quiet way, prepare us for the hardest lessons of all, learning to say goodbye. What makes this story even more powerful is how it highlights a dog's unwavering devotion. Whether it's a small family pet or a strong, protective Pitbull, every dog has the instinct to guard, comfort, and love without hesitation. Cooper's journey isn't just about growing old. It's about proving that love never fades, even in the face of time. He stays true to his nature until the very end, putting Andrew before himself, just as dogs always do. Beyond the sadness, this story carries an uplifting message, that love transcends loss. The people and animals we cherish never truly leave us. They live on in the places we shared, in the lessons they taught us, and in the quiet moments where we can still feel their presence. In the end, this isn't just a story about losing a dog. It's a story about how love, once given, never truly disappears. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.